The scorching summer sun beat down on Sweetwater Creek, a speck of dust on the map of the Montana Territory, where Katherine Rose Winters stood silently as the auctioneer's gavel came down with a decisive crack. It was 1876, and she had just lost everything. Sold. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathered crowd. Every last stick of furniture and possession belonging to the late Dr. Winters. May he rest in peace. Catherine Katy, to the few who had ever shown her kindness, clutched her threadbare shawl around her shoulders despite the heat. Her father had been Sweetwater Creek's only physician for 15 years, respected but never wealthy. What little they had possessed was now being sold to pay his outstanding debts, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a medical bag she'd managed to hide away. "Look at poor Katy Winters," came a whisper from nearby, not quiet enough to escape her hearing. 23 years old and not a penny to her name. "Nor a husband," came another voice, belonging to Millicent Bradford, the banker's wife, too busy playing nurse to her father to secure a match. "What man would want her anyway?" This from Beatrice Sterling, whose son had once courted Katy until his mother put a stop to it. No dowry, no connections, and those hands rough as a farmhand's from all that medical work. Katy kept her chin lifted, though each word stung worse than the last. The women of Sweetwater Creek had never approved of her assisting her father in his practice, learning to stitch wounds and set bones. It wasn't proper, they said. It wasn't feminine. "I hear she'll be moving into that shack by Willow Pond," continued Mrs. Bradford, "the one where old Mrs. Fletcher lived before she died of consumption." "How fitting," Mrs. Sterling replied, "from doctor's daughter to beggar in one fell swoop." Katy moved away from the crowd, unable to bear another moment of their barbed remarks. The auction continued behind her, selling off her mother's china, her father's books, even the quilt her grandmother had stitched by hand. She walked with purpose toward the edge of town, refusing to let tears fall until she was well out of sight. The shack by Willow Pond was exactly as she'd been told, dilapidated, musty, and achingly empty. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside, and daylight streamed through holes in the roof. It wasn't much, but the town council had grudgingly allowed her to stay here, out of some semblance of respect for her father's years of service. Katy set down her father's medical bag, the one thing she had insisted on keeping, and sank onto the floor. Only then did she allow herself to weep, for her father, for her lost home, and for the future that now seemed as barren as the dusty floor beneath her. She had no idea how long she sat there before a shadow darkened the doorway. "Miss Winters." Katy hastily wiped her eyes and looked up to see Sheriff Holden standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his weathered face lined with genuine concern. "Just wanted to make sure you were settled in." "As settled as one can be with nothing," she replied, then immediately regretted the bitterness in her tone. "I apologize, Sheriff. That was uncalled for. No need to apologize, Miss Winters. You've had a hard time of it." He shifted uncomfortably. "The thing is, there's a man been asking after you, a stranger in town." Katy frowned. "A stranger asking for me, whatever for. Says he knew your father during the war, name's Thomas Reed. Been riding with a cattle drive that stopped outside town, said he wanted to pay his respects." "I don't recall my father ever mentioning a Thomas Reed," Katy said cautiously. "Well, he's at the saloon now if you'd like to speak with him, or I can tell him you're indisposed." Katy glanced around the bare shack. "No, I'll go. There's nothing for me here at present." The walk back to town was hot and dusty, and Katy was acutely aware of her wrinkled dress and disheveled appearance. The saloon was not a place respectable women frequented, but given her current circumstances, her reputation seemed the least of her concerns. Sheriff Holden escorted her to the batwing doors but didn't enter. "I've got rounds to make, but Henderson behind the bar knows to keep an eye out. Reed's at the corner table." Katy nodded her thanks and pushed through the doors, immediately assaulted by the smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Several men turned to stare as she entered, conversations momentarily halting before resuming in hushed tones. She spotted him instantly. Sitting alone at a corner table, he cut an imposing figure even while seated. tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the open sky. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, brushing his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a strong jawline. When he looked up and met her gaze, Katie was struck by eyes the color of a summer storm. She approached cautiously, aware of the stares following her progress across the room. "Mr. Reed," he stood immediately, towering over her 5'5" frame. "Miss Winters, thank you for coming." His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that suggested origins somewhere in Texas. "Sheriff Holden said you knew my father," she said, remaining standing, unwilling to commit to a conversation until she understood his intentions. "I did, madam. He saved my life at Antietam. I took a bullet to the shoulder and your father dug it out while shells were dropping all around us." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Please sit. I promise I won't keep you long." Katie hesitated, then took the offered seat. "I'm afraid my father never mentioned you, Mr. Reed." "Call me Thomas or Tuck, as most folks do." A small smile touched his lips. "And I'm not surprised he didn't mention me. Your father wasn't one to tell war stories." "No, he wasn't," Katie agreed, studying the man carefully. There was something about him that seemed trustworthy, despite his intimidating appearance. "What brings you to Sweetwater Creek, Mr. Reed? It's hardly on the main cattle trails." "Tuck," he corrected gently, "and we had a buyer in these parts. I broke off from the main drive with a small herd." He paused, his expression sobering. "I heard about your father's passing when we rode in. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Miss Winters. He was a good man." "Thank you," Katie said softly, her throat tightening with unexpected emotion. "He was." Tuck seemed to hesitate before continuing. "I also heard about your situation," Katie stiffened. "News travels fast in Sweetwater Creek." "I didn't mean to offend," he said quickly. "It's just that, well, I owe your father my life, and I was wondering if there might be some way I could help." "I don't need charity, Mr. Reed," Katie said, her pride flaring despite her desperate circumstances. "Not charity," he clarified. "A job." This caught her by surprise. "A job," he nodded. "My foreman broke his leg 2 days back, clean break, but he won't be riding anytime soon. We've got 3 more stops on this drive, and I could use someone with medical knowledge." Katie stared at him, scarcely believing what she was hearing. "You want to hire me, a woman, as a trail doctor? Is that so strange? You assisted your father for years, from what I understand. And a broken bone doesn't much care whether it's set by a man or a woman." "The other cowboys might care," Katie pointed out. Tuck shrugged those broad shoulders. "They'll get over it, especially the first time one of them needs stitching up after a tangle with a ornery steer." Katie's mind raced. A job, real work using the skills her father had taught her, and a chance to leave Sweetwater Creek, if only temporarily, but the impropriety of it. "I couldn't possibly travel alone with a group of men," she said, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. Even in her reduced circumstances, there were lines a woman couldn't cross without becoming a complete social outcast. "My sister is traveling with us," Tuck said, as if anticipating this objection. "Fiona's our cook. You'd share her wagon. Your sister?" This changed matters considerably. "Widow of one of my oldest friends," he explained. "She joined up with me after her husband passed last year, says she'd rather cook for cowboys than sit around feeling sorry for herself." Katie couldn't help but admire that attitude. "When do you leave?" 2 days' time. "We're giving the cattle a chance to rest and fatten up a bit before the next leg." 2 days. Barely enough time to consider such a life-altering decision. And yet, what was keeping her in Sweetwater Creek? A leaky shack and the contempt of people who had once been neighbors and friends. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. Tuck nodded, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a folded piece of paper. "We're camped just north of town by the creek. This is a map." He slid it across the table. "Take your time, but not too much of it. We'll be moving on regardless." As Katie reached for the map, their fingers brushed briefly. A small contact, barely noticeable, and yet she felt a strange warmth spread up her arm. Flustered, she quickly folded the map and tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Reed. I'll let you know my decision tomorrow." "Tuck," he reminded her with a smile that transformed his stern features into something unexpectedly handsome. And I hope you'll say yes, Miss Winters. We could use someone with your skills. As Katie left the saloon, she felt a curious lightness in her step that had been absent for months. For the first time since her father's illness had begun, someone had valued her for her abilities rather than judging her for her circumstances. The walk back to her shack gave her time to think. The offer was unconventional, even scandalous by Sweetwater Creek standards. A single woman traveling with cowboys. The gossips would have a field day, but then they were already talking. What more could they say that they hadn't already whispered behind her back? By the time Katie reached the dilapidated structure she now called home, she had made her decision. There was nothing for her in Sweetwater Creek but memories and mockery. Perhaps out on the trail she could begin to build something new. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Katie rose with the sun. She had slept on the hard floor, her father's medical bag serving as her pillow. Her possessions were few: a spare dress, a hairbrush with several broken teeth, and a locket containing miniature portraits of her parents. Everything fit into a small cloth sack with room to spare. She washed her face in water from the pond, pinned her honey-brown hair into a neat bun, and put on her best and only dress. It was faded blue calico, mended in several places, but clean and presentable. Then, with her father's medical bag in one hand and her meager belongings in the other, Katie set out for the cattle camp. The walk took nearly an hour, and by the time she arrived, the camp was in full morning bustle. Cowboys moved between campfires and wagons, the smell of coffee and bacon thick in the air. The cattle grazed in a nearby meadow, looking peaceful in the morning light. Katie hesitated at the edge of the camp, suddenly uncertain. What if Tuck had only made the offer out of pity? What if the other cowboys refused to be treated by a woman? You must be Miss Winters. A cheerful voice interrupted her thoughts. Katie turned to see a woman approaching, wiping her hands on an apron. She was perhaps 10 years older than Katie, with auburn hair and laugh lines around her eyes. I'm Fiona Reed. My brother said you might be joining us. I haven't decided yet, Katie admitted. It's an unusual proposition. Fiona laughed, a warm, rich sound. Everything my brother does is unusual. It's what makes him such a good trail boss. Come on, I've got coffee on, and you look like you could use a cup. Katie followed Fiona to a large wagon set up as a traveling kitchen. A pot of coffee bubbled over a small fire, and the remains of breakfast preparations were evident on a makeshift table. Sit, Fiona instructed, pouring coffee into a tin cup. Tuck's checking on the herd, but he'll be back soon. Katie accepted the coffee gratefully. May I ask, what's he like to work for? Fiona considered this as she bustled around her outdoor kitchen. Fair, demanding, but never unreasonable. The men respect him because he never asks them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. She paused, giving Katie an appraising look. And he doesn't suffer fools or slackers, man or woman. I'm not afraid of hard work, Katie said firmly. I can see that, Fiona replied with a smile. Those aren't society hands you've got. Katie glanced down at her hands, rough and calloused from years of assisting her father. Hands that had stitched wounds, set bones, and delivered babies. Hands that the ladies of Sweetwater Creek had mocked, but that Tuck Reed saw value in. There he is now, Fiona said, nodding toward the edge of camp. Katie turned to see Tuck riding toward them on a magnificent chestnut stallion. He sat tall in the saddle, completely at ease, his broad-brimmed hat shielding his face from the morning sun. As he drew closer, he spotted them and changed direction, heading straight for Fiona's wagon. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size and secured his horse to a nearby hitching post before approaching. Miss Winters, he said, removing his hat. I'm glad you came. I've been thinking about your offer, Katie said, setting down her coffee cup and standing to face him. I'd like to accept on one condition. Tuck raised an eyebrow. And what's that? That I'm treated as a professional. Not as a woman who needs special consideration, but as a doctor or the closest thing to one you're likely to find on the trail. A slow smile spread across Tuck's face. That was my intention all along, Miss Winters. Welcome aboard. He extended his hand. Katie took it, his large hand engulfing her smaller one. His grip was firm but gentle, his palm calloused from years of rope work. Again, that curious warmth traveled up her arm at his touch. "When can you start?" he asked, releasing her hand. "I'm ready now," she replied, gesturing to her bag and sack. "I have everything I need right here." Tuck's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "Fiona will show you where you'll be sleeping. We've got a man needs looking at this morning. Marco caught a hoof to the ribs yesterday. Nothing seems broken, but he's pretty bruised up." "I'll see to him right away," Katie said, already mentally cataloging what supplies she might need. As Tuck walked away to attend to other business, Fiona gave Katie a knowing look. "You've impressed him already," she said. "That's not easy to do." "I'm just doing what I was trained for," Katie replied, though she couldn't deny a small glow of satisfaction. "Well, come on then," Fiona said, leading the way to a smaller wagon. "This will be our home for the next few weeks. It's not much, but it's dry when it rains and warm when it's cold." The wagon was indeed small, with just enough room for 2 narrow pallets and some storage space. But compared to the shack by Willow Pond, it seemed positively luxurious to Katie. "I'll take this side," Fiona said, indicating the left pallet. "I tend to get up before dawn to start breakfast, so I hope you're not a light sleeper." "After spending the last month nursing my father through the night, I can sleep through almost anything," Katie assured her. Fiona's expression softened. "Tuck told me about your father." "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Katie said simply, setting her belongings on the right pallet. "Now, where can I find Marco? I should examine those ribs." Marco turned out to be a young Mexican cowboy with a ready smile despite his obvious discomfort. Katie examined him professionally, noting the extensive bruising along his left side but confirming Tuck's assessment that nothing was broken. "You're lucky," she told him, applying a poultice of herbs she'd prepared from supplies in her father's bag. "A few inches higher and that hoof might have broken ribs or punctured a lung." "See, I am very lucky," Marco agreed, wincing as she wrapped a bandage around his torso. "And lucky also that LG found such a pretty doctor." Katie gave him a stern look, though there was no real heat in it. "If you want to remain lucky, Mr. Marco, you'll remember that I'm the one who decides when you're fit to ride again." This earned her a laugh from the cowboys who had gathered to watch the proceedings. "She's got you there, Marco," one called out. To Katie's surprise, there was no hostility or skepticism from the men regarding her role. If anything, they seemed relieved to have someone with medical knowledge among them. One by one, they introduced themselves: Pete, the wrangler; Darnell, the night rider; Joseph, the point rider, and half a dozen others whose names and faces began to blur together. By midday, Katie had treated 3 minor injuries, organized her medical supplies, and helped Fiona prepare lunch for the crew. It was more work than she'd done in weeks, and it felt wonderful to be useful again. As the men gathered for the midday meal, Tuck sought her out. "How's Marco?" he asked, accepting a plate of beans and salt pork from Fiona. "He'll be sore for a few days, but he can ride if necessary," Katie reported. "Though I'd recommend light duties for at least 2 days." Tuck nodded. "I'll keep him on flank position then, less demanding." He studied her for a moment. "You seem to be settling in well." "Your men have been welcoming," Katie said, "more so than I expected." "They know the value of having someone who can patch them up," Tuck replied. "Out here, a bad injury can mean the difference between making it home or not." Something in his tone made Katie look at him more closely. There was a depth of experience in his eyes that spoke of hard lessons learned. "How long have you been doing this, Mr. Reed?" "Tuck," he corrected automatically, "and I've been driving cattle since I was 16. 20 years now." "That's a long time to live on the trail," Katie observed. "It gets in your blood," he said with a slight shrug. "The open sky, the freedom of it, though lately," he trailed off, looking toward the distant mountains. "Lately," Katie prompted when he didn't continue. Tuck seemed to shake himself from whatever thoughts had claimed him. "Nothing important. We move out at first light tomorrow. We've got a 3-day drive to the next buyer in Copper Creek." With that, he moved away to speak with one of his men, leaving Katie curious about what he'd been about to say. There was more to Thomas Tuck Reed than met the eye, she decided. And despite her best intentions to keep their relationship strictly professional, she found herself wanting to know more. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity as the camp prepared for departure. Katie helped where she could, learning the rhythms and routines of trail life from Fiona, who proved to be both patient teacher and cheerful companion. That night, as Katie lay on her pallet in the wagon, listening to the night sounds of the camp men's voices around the fire, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses, she felt a strange peace settle over her. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't alone with her grief and uncertainty. She had purpose again and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of a new life. Dawn broke with a riot of color across the eastern sky, and the camp was already bustling when Katie emerged from the wagon. Fiona had been up for at least an hour, serving breakfast to the cowboys as they prepared for the day's ride. "Coffee," Fiona offered, holding out a steaming cup. "Thank you," Katie said gratefully, accepting the cup with both hands. The morning air was cool, a welcome respite from the heat that would come later. "Sleep well?" Fiona asked, turning back to her cookfire where biscuits were browning in a cast-iron skillet. "Better than I have in months," Katie admitted, "though I dreamed of cattle stampeding." Fiona laughed. "That wasn't a dream, honey. That was Darnell snoring in the wagon next to ours." Katie smiled, sipping her coffee and watching as the camp efficiently transformed from a settled encampment to a mobile operation. Wagons were loaded, horses saddled, and the cattle began to be moved into a loose formation for the day's drive. Tuck appeared on his chestnut stallion, issuing orders that were obeyed without question. In the early morning light, with his hat pulled low and his profile sharp against the sky, he looked every inch the commanding figure. "He cuts quite a figure, doesn't he?" Fiona remarked, following Katie's gaze. Katie felt her cheeks warm. "I was just observing the preparations." Fiona hummed, clearly unconvinced. "Well, we'd better get our wagon ready. We'll be traveling alongside the herd, but at a distance. Less dust that way." By the time the sun had fully risen, the cattle drive was underway. Katie rode beside Fiona on the wagon seat, watching in fascination as the cowboys expertly guided the herd along the trail. Tuck rode at the front, occasionally dropping back to check on different sections of the moving mass of cattle. "How many head are there?" Katie asked, counting but quickly losing track. "About 500, Fiona answered. "It's a small drive compared to some, but Tuck prefers it that way, says it's more manageable, especially with just 12 men. "And where do they all end up, different buyers along the way?" "We've already sold about 200 head before reaching Sweetwater. By the time we reach the final stop in Billings, we'll be down to just over 100 prime beef cattle for the hotel and restaurant trade there." The day settled into a rhythm of slow, steady progress. The countryside rolled by golden prairie grasses giving way to scrubby foothills as they moved west. Katie kept a watchful eye on Marco, noting with approval that Tuck had indeed assigned him an easier position on the flank of the herd. Around midday, Joseph rode up alongside their wagon, his face tight with pain. "Miss Winters," he called, "got a bit of a situation here." Katie immediately noticed he was cradling his right arm. "What happened?" "Branch caught me unawares when I was riding close to that copse back yonder," he explained, wincing as the wagon hit a rut. "Might have pulled something fierce." "Pull up here," Katie instructed Fiona, who obediently guided the wagon to a stop. "Let me take a look, Mr. Joseph." The cowboy dismounted awkwardly, obviously in pain. Katie helped him onto the back of the wagon and carefully examined his shoulder, probing gently with experienced fingers. "It's dislocated," she diagnosed. "I'll need to set it." Joseph paled visibly. "Is that gonna hurt as bad as I think it will?" "Yes," Katie said honestly, "but only for a moment, and if I don't set it, you'll be in far worse pain by nightfall." "Well then," Joseph said, gritting his teeth, "let's get it over with." Katie positioned herself behind him, placing one hand on his shoulder blade and gripping his arm with the other. On the count of 3, 1, 2, she pulled sharply, rotating the arm as her father had taught her. There was a distinctive pop as the joint slipped back into place, accompanied by Joseph's strangled yell. But almost immediately his expression cleared as the worst of the pain subsided. "Lord, have mercy," he breathed. "That's better already." "I'll make you a sling," Katie said, reaching for her medical bag. "And you'll need to avoid using that arm for at least a week." "A week," Joseph protested. "But I'm Point Rider. I'm afraid that's non-negotiable," Katie said firmly, "unless you want to risk permanent damage to that joint." "She's right, Joseph." Tuck's deep voice startled them both. He'd approached so quietly on his horse that neither had noticed his arrival. "Pete can take point for now. You'll ride flank with Marco." Joseph knew better than to argue with his boss. "Yes, sir." As Katie fashioned a sling from a length of clean cloth, she was aware of Tuck watching her work. His gaze was steady, assessing, but not in a way that made her uncomfortable. Rather, it felt like he was seeing her, really seeing her in a way few people ever had. "You handled that well," he said when she'd finished. "Clean and quick." "My father taught me that hesitation only prolongs the patient's pain," Katie replied, packing away her supplies. "A good lesson," Tuck agreed, "for medicine and for life." He turned to Joseph. "Can you ride?" "Yes, boss," Joseph assured him, already looking more comfortable with his arm secured in the sling. "Good, we've got a few more hours of daylight to use." Tuck tipped his hat to Katie. "Thank you, Miss Winters. Just doing my job, mister." "Read," she replied, but she couldn't help feeling pleased at his approval. As Tuck rode away to rejoin the front of the herd, Fiona gave Katie a sidelong glance. "That's twice now you've impressed him," she remarked. "Keep this up, and he might just decide he can't run this outfit without you." Katie laughed off the comment, but secretly, she found herself hoping Fiona might be right. The prospect of continuing this life being valued for her skills, working alongside people who respected her, was infinitely more appealing than returning to Sweetwater Creek and its whispers and pity. The drive continued until dusk began to settle over the land. The cowboys expertly guided the cattle into a rough circle for the night, establishing a loose corral that would keep the animals together until morning. Camp was set up with practiced efficiency fires built, wagons positioned, night riders assigned to watch the herd in shifts. Katie helped Fiona prepare the evening meal, a hearty stew that bubbled promisingly in a large iron pot suspended over the main fire. The men came in shifts to fill their plates, exchanging casual banter and relaying news from different sections of the drive. Tuck was the last to eat, waiting until all his men had been served before approaching the fire. He accepted a heaping plate from Fiona with thanks, then, to Katie's surprise, came to sit beside her on the log she'd claimed as a seat. "How are you finding trail life so far, Miss Winters?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Different," she admitted, "but not in a bad way." "There's a certain directness to it that I appreciate," Tuck nodded, understanding in his gray eyes. "Out here there's less room for pretense. A person is judged by what they can do, not who their family is or what gossips say about them." Katie looked at him sharply. "You know about the gossip in Sweetwater Creek. Small towns are all the same," he said with a slight shrug. "And I make it my business to know about the people who work for me, even those you've just hired, especially those." He took a bite of stew, chewed thoughtfully, then continued. "Sheriff Holden is an old friend. He told me how the town treated you after your father died, how they mocked you for having nothing, even though your father spent years caring for them at all hours." Katie stared into the fire, unwilling to let him see how much those memories still hurt. "They weren't entirely wrong. I did have nothing." "You had skills," Tuck countered, "knowledge, compassion, things worth far more than fancy dresses or china plates." He set his empty plate aside. "Things I value in the people who ride with me." The sincerity in his voice made Katie look up, meeting his gaze directly. In the firelight, his eyes were darker, more mysterious but no less intense. For a moment, neither spoke, and Katie felt something unspoken pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. The moment was broken by Marco, who approached with his characteristic grin. "El Jeef, Pete says to tell you the north section of the herd is restless. Might be they smell water." Tuck stood immediately. "I'll check it out. Thank you for the meal, Fiona," he called to his sister. Then, with a last nod to Katie, he strode off into the gathering darkness. Marco watched him go, then turned to Katie. "The boss likes you," he said matter-of-factly. "He doesn't usually sit with newcomers." Before Katie could formulate a response, Marco had moved away, leaving her to wonder at his words. Did Tuck Reed really see something special in her, or was he simply being courteous to a new employee who happened to be a woman? That night, as Katie lay once again on her pallet in the wagon, listening to Fiona's soft breathing, she found herself thinking of Tuck's words by the fire. He had defended her worth when everyone in Sweetwater Creek had dismissed her. He had seen value in her when others saw only lack. It was a dangerous train of thought, she knew. Tuck Reed was her employer, nothing more. To imagine anything else was to court disappointment or worse, ridicule. And yet, as she drifted toward sleep, it was his storm-gray eyes she saw, steady and appreciative in the firelight. The next 3 days fell into a pattern: early rising, long hours on the trail, and evenings around the campfire. Katie treated minor injuries and ailments among the cowboys, from saddle sores to a case of poison ivy that had Pete scratching miserably until she applied a soothing salve. True to his word, Tuck treated her as a professional, consulting her on the men's fitness for various duties and accepting her medical judgments without question. His respect elevated her status among the cowboys, who quickly came to trust her skills and seek her advice for even minor complaints. Fiona, too, became a fast friend, sharing stories of her life as a rancher's wife in Texas, and her decision to join her brother's outfit after her husband's death from pneumonia. "William was a good man," she told Katie as they prepared dinner on the third evening. "But after he was gone, I couldn't bear to stay at our little ranch. Too many memories." "I understand that," Katie said, thinking of her father's sick room, which she'd avoided entering for weeks after his passing. "Tuck offered me a place with his outfit, and I took it," Fiona continued. "Best decision I ever made. There's a freedom to this life that soothes the soul." Katie nodded, feeling the truth of those words. Despite the hard work and sometimes uncomfortable conditions, she felt more alive on the trail than she had in months, perhaps years, in Sweetwater Creek. On the afternoon of the third day, they arrived in Copper Creek, a mining town larger and more prosperous than Sweetwater. The cattle were corralled outside town while Tuck rode in to meet with the buyer, a mine owner who provided beef for his workers. While he conducted business, the rest of the outfit made camp for a 2-day stopover. The men were given permission to visit town in shifts, with strict instructions from Tuck to avoid trouble and return sober enough to work. "What about us?" Katie asked Fiona as they set up their temporary camp. "Do we get to visit town too?" "Indeed we do," Fiona replied with a grin. "In fact, Tuck always gives me money to restock our supplies and buy any personal items the men might need." And she added with a meaningful look at Katie's worn dress, "I believe we might find you something more suitable for trail life while we're at it." "Oh no," Katie protested. "I couldn't possibly. It's not charity," Fiona cut in firmly. "It's a necessity. That dress is going to fall apart before we reach Billings, and then where will you be? Besides, Tuck considers proper clothing part of your wages." Katie wanted to argue further but had to admit that Fiona was right. Her dress was showing serious signs of wear after just a few days on the trail. And the prospect of something new, something that was truly hers, was too tempting to resist. The following morning, with the camp secured and most of the men occupied with tending the herd, Fiona and Katie rode into Copper Creek in the smaller of the 2 wagons. The town bustled with activity: miners coming off shift, merchants hawking wares, and well-dressed ladies moving from shop to shop. "First things first," Fiona declared, guiding the wagon to a hitching post outside a general store. "Supplies, then personal shopping." The general store was well stocked, and the proprietor greeted Fiona by name. "Miss Reed, back with another drive, I see." "Hello, Mr. Patterson," Fiona replied cheerfully. "Yes, we're headed to Billings eventually." "And who's this with you?" Mr. Patterson asked, turning curious eyes to Katie. "Don't believe I've seen you before." "This is Miss Katherine Winters, our trail doctor," Fiona said with evident pride. "She joined us in Sweetwater Creek, Mr. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. A lady doctor? Well, I'm not actually a doctor, Katie corrected quickly. I assisted my father, who was a physician. She's being modest, Fiona interjected. She set Joseph's dislocated shoulder clean as you please, and she's kept the whole outfit in better health than we've been in years. Katie felt her cheeks warm at the praise but didn't contradict Fiona again. There was something liberating about being introduced as the trail doctor rather than poor Katie Winters who lost everything. They spent nearly an hour selecting supplies: coffee, flour, sugar, salt, beans, and various other staples that would sustain the outfit until their next stop. Mr. Patterson was helpful and fair with his prices, and he even threw in a small bag of hard candies for the men who have been too long without sweetness. With the wagon loaded with supplies, Fiona directed them to a dressmaker's shop further down the main street. Mrs. Calloway makes the most practical trail clothes you'll find, she explained, and she doesn't charge the earth for them. Mrs. Calloway turned out to be a no-nonsense woman of about 50, with clever fingers and a measuring tape perpetually draped around her neck. She assessed Katie with a professional eye. "Trail doctor, eh?" she said when Fiona had explained their needs. "You'll be wanting something sturdy but not too heavy. Split skirts for riding, I should think, and at least one decent dress for towns." Before Katie could protest the extravagance of multiple garments, Mrs. Calloway was pulling fabric samples from shelves and laying them out for inspection. The denim for the split skirts hard-wearing and won't show dirt. This cotton for shirts breathes well in the heat. And this calico for a town dress, pretty enough without being too fancy. Overwhelmed by the options after months of having none, Katie looked to Fiona for guidance. "We'll take 2 split skirts in the denim, 3 shirts in different colors of the cotton, and yes, the calico for a town dress," Fiona decided. "And proper undergarments too, of course," Mrs. Calloway nodded approvingly. "Sensible choices." "I can have everything ready by tomorrow afternoon if that suits." "Perfectly," Fiona agreed. "We're in town until morning after next." As they left the shop, Katie finally found her voice. "Fiona, that's far too much. I can't possibly accept." "You can and you will," Fiona interrupted firmly. "Consider it an investment in your future with the outfit." "My future," Katie echoed. "But this is just until Billings, isn't it?" Fiona gave her a knowing look. "That depends entirely on you, and perhaps on my brother as well." Before Katie could ask what she meant, Fiona pointed to a small cafe across the street. "Let's have some real coffee and pie that hasn't been cooked over a campfire. My treat." The cafe was pleasantly cool after the heat of the street. They secured a table by the window, and a waitress promptly brought coffee and took their order for apple pie. "Now," Fiona said once they were alone, "let's talk about what happens after Billings." "I hadn't really thought that far ahead," Katie admitted. "Well, it's time you did," Fiona replied. "Tuck mentioned that you have nothing to go back to in Sweetwater Creek." "That's true enough," Katie agreed, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "but I can't impose on your brother's generosity indefinitely." "It's not generosity if you're earning your keep," Fiona pointed out. "And you most certainly are. I haven't seen the men this healthy on a drive in years. Usually by now we've had at least one serious injury and half a dozen minor disasters." "I've hardly done anything miraculous," Katie protested. "You've done preventive care," Fiona countered. "Checking saddle sores before they become infected, making sure cuts are cleaned properly, keeping an eye on Marco's ribs. That matters." The waitress arrived with generous slices of pie, momentarily pausing their conversation. Katie took a bite of the still warm dessert, savoring the sweetness and spice after days of trail food. "The thing is," Fiona continued once they were alone again, "Tuck's been talking about settling down, not giving up the cattle business but establishing a more permanent base. He's got his eye on a spread outside Billings." Katie set down her fork, surprised. "He wants to become a rancher." "He already is, in a way. He owns cattle, just moves them around instead of keeping them in one place." Fiona took a sip of her coffee. "But he's getting older, we all are, and the constant travel is wearing. He wants something more permanent." "Why are you telling me this?" Katie asked, though she had a suspicion she knew the answer. Fiona met her gaze directly. "Because I think you could have a place there if you wanted it. Not just as a trail doctor, but as part of whatever Tuck builds next." Katie's heart beat faster at the implication. "Fiona, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything specific," Fiona said quickly. "Just that opportunities sometimes appear when we least expect them. And it would be a shame to miss one because you're too afraid to consider it." Before Katie could respond, a shadow fell across their table. She looked up to see Tuck standing there, hat in hand, looking somewhat surprised to find them in the cafe. "Fiona, Miss Winters," he greeted them. "Enjoying some town comforts, I see." "Well-deserved ones," Fiona replied with a smile. "We've restocked the supplies and ordered new clothes for Katie. Mrs. Calloway is making them." "Excellent," Tuck said, nodding approvingly. "I've just finished with Mr. Hargrove. We sold 100 head at a good price." He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you ladies might join me for dinner at the hotel tonight to celebrate a successful transaction." Fiona's eyes lit up. "Real food cooked by someone else. Try and stop me." She glanced at Katie. "You'll come too, of course." Katie hesitated, thinking of her worn dress and what the hotel dining room might be like. "I'm not sure I'm properly attired for a hotel dinner." "Nonsense," Tuck said firmly. "The Copper Creek Hotel isn't exactly the Palmer House, just clean up and come as you are." His eyes held hers for a moment. "I'd be honored by your company, Miss Winters." Put that way, how could she refuse? "Thank you, Mr. Reed, I'd be delighted." 7 o'clock then, he said, settling his hat back on his head. "I should get back to the herd." Pete mentioned something about the south pasture needing checking. With a nod to them both, he strode out of the cafe. Fiona waited until he was well out of earshot before turning to Katie with a triumphant expression. "Dinner at the hotel? He never does that, not even when we make a good sale." "It's probably just a courtesy because I'm new," Katie reasoned, though she couldn't quite suppress a flutter of anticipation. "If you believe that, you're not nearly as observant as I thought," Fiona replied with a laugh. "Now finish your pie, we have preparations to make." Back at camp, Fiona rummaged through her trunk and produced a shawl of deep blue wool. "This will dress up your outfit a bit," she said, draping it around Katie's shoulders, "and I have a bit of ribbon for your hair." "You don't need to go to such trouble," Katie protested, even as she admired the shawl's soft texture. "It's no trouble," Fiona assured her. "Besides, it does my heart good to see Tuck taking an interest in someone. It's been far too long." "An interest?" Katie echoed, her cheeks warming. "Surely you're reading too much into a simple dinner invitation." Fiona merely smiled and continued her preparations. By the time they set out for the hotel that evening, Katie had washed thoroughly, pinned her hair in a more elaborate style than usual, and donned Fiona's shawl over her freshly brushed dress. It wasn't fashionable by any means, but she felt more presentable than she had in months. The Copper Creek Hotel stood 3 stories tall, the most imposing building in town. Gas lamps illuminated its entrance, and the sounds of conversation and occasional laughter drifted from the dining room as they approached. Tuck waited for them in the lobby, and Katie nearly stopped in her tracks at the sight of him. He had clearly made an effort for the occasion, trading his trail clothes for a clean black suit, white shirt, and string tie. His dark hair was neatly combed and his beard trimmed close. He looked distinguished, handsome in a rugged way that all his fancy clothes couldn't quite tame.